Welcome to a new season of CUNY Laureates, the show about CUNY graduates who went on to win major awards in their respective fields.
On this episode, we begin a new series on MacArthur Fellowship winners from the City University of New York. First, we get a crash course in the MacArthur Foundation's so-called Genius Grant, a no-strings-attached fellowship for academics and creatives across every section of society. Ben Catcher explores the obscure and fleeting corners of New York through the art of the comic strip. And Ada Louise Huxtable writes passionately about every citizen's right to good architecture. What does it mean to be a genius? To many people, the term conjures up images of a person of vast, unmatchable intelligence, like some super advanced being out of science fiction.
Your ignorance makes me ill and angry.
But is being a genius only about intelligence? Or is genius more about one's imagination and ability to think creatively about the world around them? What we call genius can be one of these things, or both of them, or even something else entirely. Genius is often in the eye of the beholder, and who gets to be called a genius can be a source of debate, which makes it all the more impressive that a particular group of people has been earning the label of genius without much argument for more than 40 years, the MacArthur Fellows. Known unofficially as the Genius Grant, the MacArthur Fellowship is an award given each year to citizens or residents of the United States who have shown, in the words of the foundation, extraordinary originality and dedication in their creative pursuits and a marked capacity for self-direction. Admittedly, the MacArthur Foundation itself doesn't use the word genius in its award, but take one look at the grant recipients over the years, and it will be no surprise why the word stuck. The prize winners are scientists, historians, artists, activists, and many others across a wide variety of fields. Individuals who have expanded our knowledge about the world, or provoked us with new perspectives, or moved us with stirring works of art. In short, they are people who enrich the world with their ideas. And if that isn't genius, then what is? So, what is the MacArthur Foundation? And why are they awarding prizes to all these geniuses? To find out, we need to go back to the origins of the foundation itself. John D. MacArthur, a wealthy insurance and real estate magnate in the first half of the 20th century, passed away in 1978 and left the vast majority of his fortune to a private foundation he had formed 8 years earlier. Named the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the organization was tasked with spending the endowment, worth $1 billion. But it wasn't given much direction. I made the money. You guys will have to figure out what to do with it, John D. had told the board of directors before his passing. But the road to figuring it out was a bumpy one at first. Disputes quickly arose among the board about how best to use the money. In the midst of this tumult, it was John D. MacArthur's son, John Roderick MacArthur, who proposed the idea that would become the MacArthur Fellowship. After reading an editorial about the pressure placed on academics to constantly publish and apply for grants, John Roderick suggested a fellowship that would provide money with no strings attached and free recipients to focus entirely on their work. The foundation found direction in this new idea, and in 1981, the MacArthur Fellows Program was born. Each year, fellowship recipients are nominated and selected anonymously by individuals who are familiar with a variety of disciplines. While past achievements are considered, award winners are chosen primarily for their potential for future accomplishments and discoveries. Fellowship recipients receive a monetary award that they are free to use however they wish, whether that's to fund their current work, pursue entirely new fields, or even to spend on family care and financial security. The purpose, in the words of the foundation, is to provide the maximum freedom for the recipients to follow their creative vision. And they are creative visions indeed. 26 CUNY graduates have received MacArthur Fellowships to date, graduates that represent a vast range of disciplines. There have been playwrights, novelists, musicologists, and poets. They've studied family interactions in lemurs and neurological development in fruit flies, medicine in the Middle Ages and politics in Tibet. There have been civil rights lawyers, immigration activists, architecture critics, and mathematicians? That's right. CUNY's MacArthur Fellows have run the gamut of academic, artistic, and social fields. But across them all has been one thing in common: exceptional minds. They are minds that have given us new discoveries, new stories, new ways of understanding the past and the present. And for that, we can surely be forgiven for calling them geniuses. 50 years after being told to figure out how to spend John MacArthur's fortune, his foundation seems to have found quite a few worthy causes. And CUNY has been right in the thick of it, helping to teach, inspire, and propel those whose minds go on to change the world for the better. But of course, it doesn't take a genius to see that.
Writer Ben Katcher was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship in 2000. He's a storyteller who matches words to finely honed drawings depicting a life of New York City that's both real and imagined.
He's wandering around this city that's not New York. It's a city I invented. I wanted to be a tourist in this city. And I wanted the excitement of discovering a city as big as New York, maybe of the same age as New York. That's how he comes upon all of these adventures. You know, I don't know how many there are. I grew up just, you know, after underground comics. Robert Crumb, Bill Griffith, you know, and some of those concentrated on sex and, you know, drug taking. So that was done already. I felt that was not something I wanted to make comics about. I would make comics about these forgotten aspects of urban life. Yeah, I wanted to talk about small business, the impulses behind small business people. It's because it hadn't been done. I mean, I thought it was an ignored area to write about. I came across this idea that there was such a field as real estate photography. It was in a listing in the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. You know, there's a fortune to be made in real estate photography, and I'd never heard of this field, but people went around for real estate agents taking pictures of buildings. That's what it was, very utilitarian kind of work. The weekly strip is very short. They're almost like a haiku. They're like 10 lines. I would say there's a real condensed feeling to them, like a short pop song or a short poem. This strip is based on lots of things I saw or imagined or dreamt about, but Knipple is not aware of the narration. The narration is always in another voice, the voice of the author. He's not me, I'm the narrator. He's just the man who brings us around the city. And you see him suffering and going through all the anguish of a small business person. It was the year 2000. You know, I was making a decent living from comics. And so this was just this, I don't know, a kind of recognition, or I don't know that it affirmed anything to me, but maybe to other people. If you make a lot of work, you're going to raise the possibility of doing, you know, inspired work. And if that is raised to happen often enough, somebody says, wow, almost every strip this person does is pretty good. I don't know that the word genius is the answer. It's more like you're in this place where you can do a lot of inspired work. The actual wording of the fellowship is for your promise, for your work that you will do, not necessarily for what you've done. Brooklyn College was sort of the neighborhood college where I grew up in the Kensington section of Brooklyn. I majored in studio art. You know, at that time, there was the English department and the art department, but in the antique forms of drawing and writing, they never came together. Whenever I talked about stories with my art teachers, they said, well, if you have to make up a story, you know, do it, but it doesn't, I have nothing to say about stories. I was able to do figure drawing, which came in handy for making comics. A lot of people outgrow the comics they grew up with, which whether they were superheroes or, you know, adventure comics. I sort of outgrew them from a literary point of view. And I started reading at Brooklyn College, and I took a lot of literature courses. A lot, it seems like a lot. I read a lot, you know, a novel a night. My interest in storytelling moved outside of those genres. So I knew I had to make comics that dealt with all sorts of aspects of the world. Over the years, I was always attracted to dairy restaurants. There were quite a few of them in New York, and I went to them since my childhood and as a young adult. And I would say in the 70s and 80s, they were all closing as I went to them. The ones I knew in New York were all run by Eastern European Jews. They were below the notice of restaurant historians, and they were not like touristic places that would even have postcards. A lot of them I drew from memory because I didn't take pictures of them. I talk about this thing that I call the Milch Dicke personality, the dairy personality. The atmosphere in these places was a very low-key, ruminative more than appetitive. People sat and thought about things, hatched schemes. They didn't do anything. They just, a lot of thinking and sitting around and over a cup of coffee and a noodle kugel. Everything, you know, you see around us, like the shapes of these very standard, the salt shakers, these napkin holders, are just imbued with a lot of significance just because they follow you through life. They're the background material to everyone's life. And you don't think about them, but they're there. Just like dairy restaurants. You know, I went to these places and I just took them for granted. I said, these are here. They were here before I was born, and they'll probably be here forever. But that wasn't the case. The pedagogical point of the strip is to make people aware of a certain kind of urban life that's somewhat endangered in certain cities by, you know, globalization, chain stores, gentrification, all these things that make it really hard for a small business like the one we're in right now to exist. I think if you read these strips, you'll realize what the value of that kind of, the invention of small business. Small business people have to be inventive. They don't have a lot of money to pay a designer to do their signage. So there's that kind of invention going on. And I think that's what I like people to come away with.
Our next genius had strong opinions, especially about buildings. Yet the architecture of the city, she wrote, is never found in one individual building, but rather in the way it relates to the city itself and its people. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a MacArthur Fellow and her unwavering fight to preserve the soul of our city.
Will you welcome, please, direct from the Times, Ada Louise Huxtable. What would you say, though? Isn't New York worse now than it was when I came here a few years ago?
I think New York is getting progressively worse. In fact, the things you said at the beginning of the show, which were so amusing, also made it very clear how bad it is. The breeze that stops the subway and the pollution in the air. And yet we are all very dedicated. We do stay here. And you say you'd like to leave, but there is a tremendous commitment to the city by many people. There's something about the city. It has a kind of a magic and magnificence in spite of all its problems that keeps people here.
Ada Louise Huxtable, the first full-time architecture critic at the New York Times, may have looked like a gentle soul, but you wouldn't want to find yourself on the receiving end of her criticism. She loved the city and its history and despised any new work of architecture that didn't fit in its grandeur. According to Ada, good architecture was every New Yorker's right, and she was more than willing to dedicate her career to defending it. This sentiment, however, didn't develop in a vacuum. Born in 1921 to a middle-class family on the Upper West Side, Ada was exposed to good architecture since her early childhood. In fact, her family home, St. Urban on 285 Central Park West, was a well-known New York City landmark. Her appreciation for good architecture only grew stronger after she started attending art history classes in another famous New York City landmark, Hunter College. It was there that she had her first experiences with hands-on design. Her set design work on the Hunter College productions of Yellow Jacket in 1940 attracted some curious eyes at the New York Times editorial and heralded her later involvement with this giant of American journalism. While at Hunter, she also won the first prize in an interior design contest sponsored by Bloomingdale's. This eventually led to her employment in another iconic building. After graduating from Hunter with honors in 1941, she started working at the Bloomingdale's flagship store on Lexington Avenue. Her tenure as a sales clerk in the furniture department was cut short after a surprising encounter. Many young architects and designers made the obligatory tour of the rooms, she later wrote. One of them noticed and married me. Garth Huxtable, an industrial designer, became Ada's partner, not only in marriage, but also as a lifelong supporter of her illustrious career. Ada continued her studies at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, and in 1946, she was offered a position at the Museum of Modern Art in the Department for Architecture and Design. Working under the famed architect Philip Johnson, she developed a keen eye for modern architecture, an ability that would prove extremely valuable in her later career. In 1950, after receiving a Fulbright Fellowship, she left the Museum of Modern Art and spent a year in Italy, studying post-war Italian architecture. And in 1958, she received a Guggenheim grant for research in the field of structural and design advances in American architecture. Equipped with this new knowledge and experience, Ada returned to her home city and started writing. At first, her elegant writing style seemed a natural fit for the pages of more traditional art magazines, where the ideal of aesthetics in architecture left little room for questions about practicality or social impact. As her articles started addressing contemporary topics, it became evident that her writing talent came with an extraordinary ability to break down even the most complex issues of modern architecture and make them relatable to everyday readers. This ability didn't go unnoticed, and in 1963 she was hired by the New York Times as the first full-time architecture critic, a position specifically created for her.
There was no architecture critic. In fact, when I started writing for the New York Times and when Clifton Daniel asked me to do the job full-time, he said, "What shall we call you?" And we decided that it was architecture critic.
Using the New York Times as a platform, Ada continued her professional ascent. As her intelligent and fearless commentary started shaping the views of the general public, the underlying theme of her criticism became more evident. Architecture is not an isolated act of creating physical structures. It is a social practice that has profound effects on urban environments, as well as on the lives of the people who live in them.
I think it's the greatest of the arts because it is such a complex art. It's the art we must live with. You want to experience painting or sculpture, it's an option. But there is absolutely nothing optional about your experience of architecture.
As one of the defining voices of the modernist era, Ada was known as a supporter of change and innovation in architecture. But, unlike some of her modernist contemporaries, she also understood the importance of historic preservation. Deeply affected by the demolition of the historic Penn Station site, she wrote, "We would probably be judged not by the monuments that we build, but by the ones that we destroyed." Over the years, she became known as the champion of the preservation movement and used her influence to promote the enactment of the first landmark law in 1965. Yet her understanding of preservation went far beyond the regular traditionalist point of view. She heavily criticized what she called the Disneyfication of New York, seen in the corporate beautification of its historical sites. This fierce criticism of the corporate-driven architecture and the lack of meaningful planning in the public sphere became the defining characteristic of her life work. Feared by many and respected by all, this petite woman became both the darling of the public and at the same time its most fearsome critic. In 1970, Ada was awarded the first ever Pulitzer Prize for criticism, and in 1981, at the age of 60, after working in the daily grind at New York Times for nearly 3 decades, she received a MacArthur Fellowship. Now financially independent, she was able to quit the New York Times and start writing on her own terms. This, however, didn't mean less productivity. For another 3 decades, Ada Louise Huxtable continued to write with the same youthful passion and commitment, covering the widest range of topics, from biographical accounts to questions of public zoning, discussions about the essence of architecture or protection of cultural sites. In her last article, published a couple of weeks before her death at the age of 91, Ada made a case against the proposed radical remodeling of the New York Public Library. In her passionate plea, she argued that the Beaux Art masterpiece plays an essential role in keeping the city's dynamic vitality and brutal beauty alive. Less than a week after her text got published, New York Public Library announced that it was going to reconsider its plans for remodeling.
In 2013, a year after Ada's death, the Getty Institute announced its acquisition of her archive, a huge body of work containing 93 boxes and 19 file drawers of Ada's manuscripts and other documents. But even larger is the impact she had on the city she called home, where she implored a generation of architects to reconsider the relationship between the future and the past. And to half a century's worth of ordinary New Yorkers, this soft-spoken architecture critic had the roar of a lion.